Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you guys to our session. Today we're going to be talking about the future of APSA, the future of research, the future of education, and the future of our clinical surgical realm. We're going to start off, though, by talking a little bit about issues that affect all of us, issues about wellness, issues about burnout. We are very, very fortunate today to have Dr. Jo Shapiro. She is an associate professor of otolaryngology at Harvard Medical School. In 2008, she founded the Brigham and Women's Hospital Center for Professionalism and Peer Support, where she served as the director for 10 years. This center has become the model for institutions seeking methods to enhance trust, respect, and help improve clinician well-being. As you know, physician burnout has been a significant issue in our in the media recently, and over 50% of physicians have reported feelings of burnout, depression, and suicidal ideation. Those numbers significantly increase among general surgeons, and so this is a very timely topic. Dr. Shapiro has served on the Ethics and Professionalism Committee of the American Board of Medical Specialties. She's a founding scholar at the Academy of Harvard Medical School and the president of the Society of University Otolaryngologists. And very importantly, she was one of Brigham and Women's first female division chiefs. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Shapiro.
Thank you. Clicker. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. And though this topic sounds horrible, it won't be. Because the beauty of working with surgeons is that we are doers, and I think a lot of us are working towards doing something about this challenge that Dr. Dasgupta just outlined really nicely. I want to start off by saying that this concept of well-being is as huge as we all know it is, and it's very hard to get our arms around what it means, what are the factors, and also, therefore, what are the solutions to improving well-being, and then on the other side, to decreasing burnout. And this was a diagram that some colleagues put together around trying to sort of sort this out. And I want to say that I applaud them for doing this. And also, I don't think it tells the story all that correctly. So one of the problems that we ran into thinking about this on a national and international level, I think in the beginning, was that people were focused really solely on personal resilience. You're supposed to eat right, we're supposed to do yoga and meditate and go for 10-mile runs and all these other things. And I'm not here to say that those things aren't important. Some of them I do, some not. But what I wanted to say is that it is grossly unfair to ask us to deep breathe through a really, really dysfunctional system. So this diagram makes it look like efforts are in different quadrants, and in fact, their efforts should be integrated, and it should be more of a yes and rather than we have the solution, and by the way, it's on you to make that happen. And the other thing that I think happened with the resilience movement was that it put everything on the individual, but it didn't acknowledge the fact that the very things that we're telling people to do as individuals aren't doable in the current system in which we're working many times. There's not the time set up, there's not the resources to be able to actually do personal resilience. So again, I'm not against it, I just want to give it in perspective. I put this up to say that I've had the pleasure of working in helping lots of different organizations, different sizes, shapes, etc., across the U.S. and also some other countries. And what strikes me, and I understand that we all have our different specialties and our different, there's different age groups and genders and all sorts of other differences. What's so striking to me is how similar the culture of medicine is across all the places that I've been. So many similarities, and I think that's what we need to look at in this program that I want to discuss with you. So I just invite you privately to think of the time when you were involved in a medical error that caused patient harm. So I never leave time for this exercise because every single person I know, every single clinician, we know it's there. We know it. You can call this up, whether it happened, 2 weeks ago or 20 years ago. We're wired as humans to remember negatively, emotionally impactful things. What we do know from studies, and I think from our own individual and collective experience, is that there are some very, very common emotions that might occur after these events. One of them is sadness, and close on the heels of that can be this sense of shame. And shame is defined as when you, in this situation, you go from saying, I feel terrible that happened, to this happened because I'm not good enough. I'm not a good enough surgeon. In fact, I wonder if I could or should be able to continue this work because this is so unbearable. How could I have let this happen? And this sense of shame is very pervasive, and it's also very hard to bear. And I was thinking, why are we so ashamed after errors? And one of the things that caught my eye was a study by Helmrath that was looking at the similarities between enculturation in aviation and in medicine, and found that both stress the need for perfection and a deep perception of personal invulnerability. So if we're taught and we come to believe and internalize, and society expects of us perfection, and then of course we're not perfect, it's very hard to bear that dissonance. And I have really bad news for all of us, is that the way we're going to keep patients safe is not by eliminating human error, because human error is impossible to remove from any of us and from any enterprise. We are wired to make errors. We have a responsibility to keep patients from becoming the brunt of those errors, from reaching the patient and causing harm, and we also have the responsibility personally to decrease the chance that we'll make a human error so that we're well rested, we are well trained, we call for help when we need it, etc. But everybody is wired to make errors, and that is just not something we've been taught, and we haven't understood that we have to know that in order to actually make the system safer. So when we do make an error, it's a cause of significant shame. I think, I say physicians, but I think surgeons in particular, we are really valued for putting our head down and getting our work done. That's sort of the Patriots mantra of do your job. That's what we were taught, and that's what we continue to teach, and it's a great thing. But these are moments when it is hard to just put your head down. And the other thing we're taught, either explicitly or implicitly, is it's not supposed to hurt, right? We're not supposed to be affected emotionally. Even regardless of whether there's been an error or it's an adverse event or it's just we're seeing something horrible. You see a child in a motor vehicle accident, and you do the best care you can, and the child dies, and it's not supposed to hurt. And of course, it does hurt, and it hurts for a good reason. It hurts because we're human and we care and we're compassionate and dedicated. But nothing about our training really has allowed us to process these events because they're not supposed to hurt. And then usually, of course, a lot of us went into surgery because we want to fix things. And now we're in a situation where we've actually been part of making things worse and may not be able to fix it. And that's really, really hard for us as individuals, and I think collectively. I think close on the heels of these feelings of shame can be this fear. So we're afraid of getting sued. We're afraid that we've lost the trust maybe of the patients and their families. And I think another realistic fear is we're afraid of what our colleagues are going to think of us. We're afraid of our reputation. And that can be actually very frightening, partly because we care so much about what our colleagues think of us, and partly because our financial, if you will, professional well-being depends on trust of our colleagues to send us patients. If you think that we judge each other fairly and compassionately after errors, think again. We don't. We don't tend to. This is one study, actually, sorry, I'm just going to skip this, that looked at the result, the reputational result of deaths in the OR, differentially towards women surgeons versus men. And I put this up because, to me, well, it's obviously unconscious bias. People aren't saying, oh, I'm going to treat women surgeons one way and men surgeons another, but it's unconscious bias. But the point is that it's just an example of how we do unconsciously punish each other when we've been involved in unexpected outcomes. So I just wonder, did you all get the memo that we're done with shame and blame? No, right. We didn't get a memo. Nobody sent a memo. We grew up and we teach shame and blame. That was the cornerstone of M&M. Like, you stand up, you take it, you say, I did this, I was bad. People tell you, how could you do this? Don't ever do it again. And we did this, and we've done it because we thought it was the right thing to do. We did. We thought it made things safer. Like, if I just, make somebody feel really bad about something, they'll never do this again. But the problem with shame and blame is, it not only doesn't it work to make the system safer, it actually is destructive for several reasons. Number one, if I see you treated that way by your colleagues in your organization in a humiliating fashion, then the chance of my reporting something that's gone wrong, right, to somebody who needs to know goes down. And we underreport our errors. And the other thing is, if I'm doing an event analysis in M&M and all I'm looking at are the personal accountability factors, what did you do wrong, and I'm not taking into account the fact that the system might have set you up to make that error, then even if you don't make that error again, someone else, one of your colleagues, will make the same error down the line because we haven't changed the conditions. And most of us make errors because, again, we're human and we're wired to. At the time that we make them, we think we're making the right decision and it's wrong, or the right technique and it's wrong. It's not because people come in and they say, I don't care, and I'm just going to do it how I feel like it, or I'm too lazy to do it the right way. So punishing for human error actually is destructive. Now, I am in no way saying we shouldn't hold ourselves and each other personally accountable for our outcomes, including our errors. In fact, personal accountability is crucial. It needs to be personal accountability and systems accountability. It's not either or. And the other thing I want to say is, if I've made the same error 4 times, that is a problem with me, and maybe I need further training or need to be in a different, not doing this particular procedure. So it's not this sort of black and white that how we've treated it in the past. And then the malpractice system is totally shame and blame. They don't tend to sue a system. They sue us as individuals. But I think many of you know, we're going to be moving away, and a lot of us have, from the malpractice system by doing communication resolution programs where we're not giving individual blame to individual surgeons, individual clinicians. We're looking at what was the outcome, what happened, and how can we make the patient whole, either financially or otherwise. And I think that will change. But we're operating, if you will, in a shame and blame world. And this is devastating when we make errors. And I think the other thing that happens is, as I say, there are external regulatory agencies that are judging us in a way that can be very shame and blame oriented. And I included some of these. Some are from other countries, like the Inspectorate. But we know that these external organizations sometimes actually do not treat us fairly as individuals. So all of this can lead us to feeling very isolated. And we're mammals, and mammals are highly social. When we've made errors in particular, we tend to feel very much alone. And we've been taught to leave each other alone. Don't talk to anybody, and you just don't admit it, or you don't tell anybody you're hurting. And that's how we grew up. And that's how we have been training the next generation. And the trouble is, isolation causes acute and chronic stress, and it's absolutely unnecessary and wrong. So I'm arguing that many people can be impacted in these vulnerable moments of errors, adverse events. And I do want to say that what I'm going to propose and what we've been working on for 10 years, this peer support program, is not just for errors, but errors are very hard to support for because of all this cultural shame and blame that we are operating in. So I think all these people may need support and deserve the support. So most of us, it feels terrible acutely, but we do get through it, but not always. Sometimes time does not heal. And there are tons of studies, and I could have put up many more, but I just chose a couple, that show there can be lasting negative fallout for physicians who are involved in errors. Sometimes years after the event, sometimes even when there was zero patient harm, simply a near miss. We know from the data that if you're involved in a medical error, you have a higher chance of becoming burnt out, and if you're burnt out, and if you have been involved in a medical error, you have a higher chance of becoming depressed. We also know that if you're burnt out, you have a higher chance of making a medical error. We've got to interrupt this cycle. It's time to stop it. If you've made a medical error, you have a higher chance of suicidal ideation. Now, nobody thinks that errors are the only driver for physician suicide, but they are a driver, very much so. And I don't know if you know the suicide statistics, but let me summarize it by saying this. Every single day in this country, a physician dies by suicide. Every single day. And if you are a male physician, your chance of dying by suicide is 40% higher than men in the US. If you're a woman physician, your chance of dying by suicide is 130% higher than women in the US. We have an epidemic. These are our colleagues. We've got to do something. And as I said, errors are not the only driver, but they are a known driver. So our question was, and should be, okay, how can we facilitate resilience after adverse events? And resilience being defined as growth after trauma. The barriers for getting support to increase resilience are myriad, and you're not surprised by any of these. We're just ashamed. We feel people are going to judge us. We're worried about where's the information going to go? How do we even access it? And do I even have time to pay attention to myself right now because I'm so busy? I really don't. We did a study where we actually asked physicians about lots of different emotional stressors, potential stressors, and in particular, this slide shows the answer to one of the questions, which was if you were involved in an error, where would you most like to get support? And 88% of physicians wanted to receive support from a physician colleague. Even though we have great psychiatrists and other mental health practitioners, employee assistance program clinicians, that's not in these moments where we want to go. We also were involved in another study that looked at those physicians who'd made an error, reported having made an error, were willing to be studied, if you will, looking at the factors that actually were positively correlated with growth and recovery after trauma, this trauma of having made an error. And one of the factors was talking about it with colleagues. So if we know all this, we need to design programs that meet the needs that are clearly expressed. And so I put forward to you one model, and that's what we've been using for 10 years, and that is peer support, because that's what we want. We do group peer support. If we think a whole team might be affected, we'll bring the team together in a facilitated way. And many times in addition to that, or sometimes instead, we reach out to the involved clinicians and offer peer support. We don't wait for people to suffer, because we know statistically that some are going to suffer in a prolonged fashion, and most of us are suffering acutely. And so we also know that having been there is a really strong positive factor for people to be willing to speak to somebody about getting support. Now, I also say that when I first started the program, I trained 50 non-mental health practitioner clinicians to be peer supporters. Guess how many peers reached out asking for support? 0. I said we were all dressed up for a party and nobody showed up. So we changed this many years ago to a reach out program. We reach out whenever there's an event that could be stressful, and it doesn't have to be an error. It could be you're being named in a lawsuit, a colleague is ill, some crisis has happened to you in your life. You will get an offer of peer support. You don't have to take it, but you will get an offer of peer support from a colleague who's trained to offer formal peer support. I believe we should be offering peer support for adverse events, even if there's no error, for disclosing and communicating adverse events with patients and their families. It can be a very charged moment for us. We should get help to do it because we don't do it well if you look at the data. Being reported to the Board of Registration, being named in litigation, chronic stressors, managing the documentation that we're required to do. Any of these can cause stress, and if we're aware, we can reach out and offer support. Patient aggression can be very, very upsetting. Taking care of trauma victims. You know, you didn't do anything wrong, you did your best, and still you watched something horrible happen. I think we should be offering our colleagues support for that. They don't have to take it, but it should be there. I do believe, just in conclusion, that peer support is a cultural driver, a change driver for going from a culture of everything is on your shoulders, you are alone, it's all your responsibility, and therefore it's all your fault, to yes, we do have personal accountability, we do have a big sense of responsibility, and we're in a community we're in a team and we're in a community of colleagues, and it's our responsibility to be there for each other, because at one point or another we're all going to be in these difficult situations. We can move from shame and blame to just culture, which is a culture of safety where the people working in the organization feel safe in the interest of making patients safe, but for our own well-being. We can go from saying we're supposed to be perfect to saying we'll try as hard as we can to do the best we can, but we are human and we may make errors, so let's learn from those and not repeat them. The expectation that whatever we do, we signed up for and it shouldn't hurt, to actually, no, it's normal to feel pretty bad in these situations. We're not telling people don't feel bad. Can we help you move through that? And then, of course, this sense you're alone. This peer support, by definition, is saying you're not alone. You will absolutely never be alone. And finally, and this is something I think has really been deeply ingrained in us in our training and sort of in the culture in which we practice, the idea that taking care of ourselves is selfish. When we know, in fact, that you can't give what you don't have. You cannot be a great surgeon if you're falling apart inside. You can't. On either a cognitive, emotional, or even physical level, you have to take care of yourself. And I don't mean acutely in the moment where you are responsible for someone else, but I mean at some point, we need to pay attention to ourselves so that we can really hold on to that immense joy that most of us feel in this incredible profession that we have the honor of being part of. I think it shows all of these efforts will help us show up with compassion for our patients and families, and also for ourselves and each other. You'll notice I don't use the term second victim. The patient advocates I've worked with don't like it. They don't like us identifying ourselves as victims if we have harmed them, and I have to respect that. I do also, this is a quote having nothing to do with medical error from Parker Palmer, who's an educator and activist, and I think the way he puts the idea that victimhood is probably not a good stance for us anyway. It takes away our agency, and we have a lot of agency in this, and I can tell you that, and there are people in this room who are working on this and who I'm collaborating with, is we're going to do more and more of this. It doesn't have to look exactly like our program, but we need to wake up and say, We have to help each other because we're in this together, and that's what the beauty of a society like APSA is. It helps us form and solidify and keep supporting us as a community of people that actually care about each other. And that's, I think, why many of us want to come to meetings. It's both learning the cognitive new frontiers, and it's also connecting with each other in this way that helps us really sustain our careers. So I want to thank you also for everything you do, particularly, you're actually the clinical care that you give, because we need you so badly in this world. So thank you for that. And also thank you for caring enough about this to show up for this, and also for all the work that those of you are working in this space. And I think we all will be to some extent going forward. Thank you for your time, commitment, intelligence, and wisdom.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Shapiro for that fabulous talk. It really makes us think. I would like to ask Dr. Stylianos to come up. This session is a tribute to Dr. Peter Altman. Dr. Stylianos will present.
Thank you, Roshni. Peter Altman had a brilliant career capped by serving as APSA's 33rd president. He was the first surgeon-in-chief at the then Babies Hospital and directed the fellowship program at Columbia for 20 years. Receiving the Salzburg Mentorship Award was a cherished highlight. Peter would probably get annoyed if during this tribute we simply recited his accomplishments, as he always preferred to shine the spotlight on his trainees and associates. Respecting this preference, Peter's trainees will soon be featured in a short video. First, a few facts to set up the video. Peter was born in Forest Hill, Queens. His father an attorney, his mother a homemaker. Highlights from his youth included being the best stickball player in the borough of Queens. And for several summers, he worked as a cabana boy at the Fontainebleau Hotel on Miami Beach, where at that time the poolside was littered with A-list Hollywood superstars, including the Rat Pack. And some of those stories are legendary and for another occasion. Peter was an avid baseball player. As a matter of fact, he matriculated at Colgate University, and he majored in baseball for the first 2 years. When he realized, though, that the Yankee scouts were not coming, he pivoted towards medicine, and we're all very fortunate for that. Peter trained under Dr. Judson Randolph, and shortly thereafter, while on the faculty, he pioneered bringing the Kasai operation to North America, and he performed the first Kasai here with his mentor and close friend, Dr. John Lilly. This created a lifelong pursuit and many contributions in that field. During his presidential address, Peter outlined several principles that certain tenets that were very valuable to him during his life and his career. And you're going to hear these tenets in a few moments. You can see that he says, and quoting, "Be assured that I do not propose these as substitutes for nor supplements to the Ten Commandments. Rather, they are just some observations I've made or things I wish I had done differently. I don't contend that adherence to these principles will guarantee happiness, nor will ignoring them necessarily result in disappointment." So now we're going to hear from 13 of Peter's trainees and APSA members as we learn of Peter's principles once again.
Altman principle number 1. Tolerate risk. Don't be risk averse.
Principle 2. It's easy to accumulate adversaries. don't.
Peter.
Altman principle number 3. The decision not to operate is usually the wrong one.
Peter's principle number 4. Never shut responsibility in public.
Peter's principle number 5. When negotiating, forget about the minutia.
Principle number 6. Your personal presence is persuasive.
Altman principle number 7. Expect reward for what you deliver, not in advance.
Principle number 8. It's okay to compromise and okay to bluff, but never threaten.
Principle number 9. It is okay to fool others, but don't fool yourself.
Principle number 10. Draw the line. Be prepared to walk away.
Principle number 11, innovate, don't just imitate.
Principle 12, stop whining. Nobody really cares.
Altman principle number 13, don't confuse yourself with Michael Jordan. You're not indispensable.
Peter Altman was fiercely loyal to his family and friends, those he admired, trusted, and loved. While his golden years were stolen, and in particular from his 4 grandchildren, his impact and legacy lives on. Thank you very much.
So we're going to transition now to 3 talks. We're going to have a talk on the future of clinical surgery, clinical research, a talk on how we could use technology and all the great things that we've learned about during this session, and how we can integrate the technology into our practices, and then a talk about basic science and translational research. We're going to start off with Dr. Katherine Deans. Kate is a associate professor from the Ohio State University. She is the director of the Center of Surgical Outcomes Research at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus. She's had research extensively funded through the AHRQ, the NIH, and PCORI, as well as the Thrasher Research Fund. The primary focus of her work is in clinical trials that test interventions to improve patient-centered outcomes. And she was a really good intern at the MGH.
Well, okay, hello. So about 6 months ago, let's see if I can get this to work, Ron asked me if I would be willing to give this talk today. After I said yes, that's when he said it's going to be TED style. And the podium is my safe place. It's my happy blanket when I give talks, so please bear with me. I hope I don't fall up here. Initially, I thought that I was going to focus on the history of clinical research in our field, and I did a lot of thinking about that. And then I had to have a very kind of come to Jesus moment with myself, and that is, I'm awful at history. In fact, much to Dr. Adzik's chagrin when I was the fellow in Philadelphia, and probably any attending who ever trained me, I can't even answer the simplest of surgical history trivia. So I'm very grateful that we got the book this year. And so for me to prattle on, oops, sorry about that. Make sure I've got this right here. I'm confused by this. Yeah. So for me to prattle on about the history of innovation in pediatric surgery and research would not only be disingenuous, but it actually would be very, very misleading. And so I thought, well, maybe I should talk about some other kind of history that I know a lot about and I'm pretty good at, and that would be the history of clinical research methods in the sector, in the healthcare economy, in the healthcare sector. And I could talk about how, as a profession, we started out with a lot of technical reports, and this evolved into small retrospective studies, and now has blossomed into a bigger dossier of health services research and implementation science, trials, and QI. And then I realized I'd be the only one in the room who cared. And so I decided that probably wasn't a good idea either. And when I dismissed that, I felt like I heard your collective sigh from the future thanking me for not spending 20 minutes talking about research methods. So I'm not going to do that. So I repeatedly asked myself, what is it about what we do as pediatric surgeons and what we do with our clinical research that makes us collectively unique, effective in driving our clinical practices forward, and also puts us in the very special position of being able to more broadly influence scientific discovery. Well, it's the very patient-centric nature of what we do. So even though I can't recount to you the dates and the times and the people for all the things that have been done in the history of our profession, I can very easily recount the stories of the deep professional and personal sacrifice that have been made to keep the wellness and the health of children at the very core of what we do clinically and how it shaped our clinical research programs, not just in the past, but today, in the current day, and also going into the future. And so this is my simple, straightforward message to you. It's a single message. It's not a mic drop moment or anything like that. But the future of clinical research really lies in the service to our patients. It always has, and it always will. And so what does that mean? Well, I believe that service to our patients within clinical research means that it's very important, it's imperative, that we actually understand their needs and their expectations, and then we have to design research that meets the needs and expectations of the patients. And if we do this, continue to do this, we will be uniquely positioned to drive innovation in clinical research more broadly, even outside of child health. And so what I mean by that, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth, is we will be able to prepare the adult healthcare world for their future consumer. And we can do that by focusing on two areas, healthcare decision-making and the learning healthcare system, which I'm going to be explaining to you. But first, let's start up by looking at who our patients are. Who is your patient in this schematic? In pediatric healthcare, access, communication, expectations, and outcomes related to treatment strategies are intrinsically linked both to the child and to the caregiver. And this puts us in a very unique position because we need to incorporate the essential role of the caregiver and of the parent to everything we do, right? This is what we do in the day-to-day. And then we also have this population of teenagers and young adults who are sort of semi-autonomous in their decision-making. Therefore, this makes medical decision-making in our field inherently more team-based compared to some of the other areas of healthcare. And it also provides us with the insight into the expectations of future generations of healthcare consumers that we can share with our colleagues in adult healthcare. So I know Erica Newman yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, had the millennials stand up in the audience, and I'm not going to do that. And I know the topic of talking about millennials has become a bit of a tired one. But I do want to camp here for a couple minutes, because when we think about who our patients are, they are the millennials, because those are the parents right now, and they are the Gen Zers, who are the little kids that we take care of, my teenage kids, for example. So millennials became the largest generation in the labor force in 2016, and commiserate with that, you know what they started doing? Having babies. So they became the patients and the people that we do our healthcare decision-making with all the time. So our parents are millennials, our patients are Gen Zers and beyond. We don't know what comes next, if it's AA or A1 or whatever it's going to be. So today's parents are going to be tomorrow's patients in adult healthcare, and today's patients are going to be tomorrow's parents. Parents' expectations on healthcare as a consumed service and good for their child are likely to extend to their own personal expectations in the future. And teenagers' expectations on being a consumer today, and we don't think we should learn from teenagers, but we have so much to learn from them, will likely extend to their expectations for healthcare when they become parents. So by developing clinical research that evaluates the needs and expectations of our population, we can inform the adult healthcare sector more broadly on how to prepare for their future consumer. Well, what are the needs and expectations of these two groups? Let's talk about the millennials first. I think we all know a lot of this. They are a very transparent, data-driven group, and they like everything to be automated. They're always connected to the internet, whether it's through social media or just peer groups and other mechanisms. And what they've shown in a lot of generational research, based on how they buy services and products, is that personal reviews outweigh status, which is very interesting because the Gen Xers like myself and the baby boomers before us were very much status-oriented people. And then there's this last bullet, that millennials feel entitled and intrinsically valuable. And it comes off so negative when you say it out loud to someone. But in fact, when it comes to shared decision-making, we should all feel entitled and we should all feel intrinsically valuable, especially as it relates to healthcare decisions for ourselves and for our children. So that's where they live. They live in that space. The Gen Zers, so the teenagers and the young adults, They take all these things a little bit more to the extreme. There's been a bunch of research around the attention span of the Gen Z population. So if any of you have teenagers or young kids in the audience, you can probably relate to this. They have very low attention spans. They actually took 100 Gen Zers, older generation Gen Zers, 100 Millennials, 100 Gen Xers, and 100 baby boomers, and they put them in a room, well, not at the same time, obviously, with computer monitors, and they had them surf the internet, and then they stalled some of the websites loading, and they found that in the Gen Z generation, if it took longer than 2 seconds, that's 1,000, 1,000, for it to load, they said it was broken, they never wanted to go back to it, they completely dismissed that source of information. So what does that mean? That means that they want things when they want it, and they want it now. And we're going to have to respond to that, just like the rest of the economy has to respond to it. Interestingly, they don't differentiate between physical and virtual, which seems kind of funny, but when you think about how they're all plugged in all the time, that makes a lot of sense. So what do we expect our patients to do? They take a day off work, they take their child out of school, they get in their car, they drive 45 minutes to the hospital, they take 10 minutes to find parking, they sit in your waiting room for 20 minutes, for me closer to an hour, and then they go back into the exam room and there for 10 minutes or so waiting for you. You walk in, the child has a bump on their arm, it's a cyst, you say, oh yeah, that's a bump on your arm, we're going to take that off. Their whole day was just spent for that. So, and then they have to reverse engineer that entire process to get home. That's not the way this generation is going to want to get their surgical care. They're going to want to plug into something online, click some boxes to what the signs and symptoms are, put a picture in, put a video in, and they want you to schedule surgery. Diagnosis and schedule right there within 10 minutes. That's what they're going to want. And if we think we're not going to have to do that, we're fooling ourselves a little bit, because there's other areas of child health and adult health right now that they're already doing that. It just hasn't really hit surgery yet. Interconnectivity is assumed in the Generation Z generation. So they expect, they won't even think about it, they expect that our radiology reporting system talks to our EHR, and it's seamless. And that all ends up in some really beautiful UI, user interface, that's accessible to us and accessible to them on some kind of mobile technology, provides them with information, and then they can actually communicate back with us. So that doesn't really exist in near real time right now. But that's going to be their expectation, because that's how they live their lives consistently every day. And then the last thing is about privacy, which is actually very interesting. I can see by panning the color of hair across the room that we've got baby boomers in here, Gen Xers, Millennials, and probably not anyone in Gen Z. When I look at my own family, my mother, who's 80, she is feels very strongly about privacy. So she goes to a bank. She mails a check to pay her bills. She does a little online shopping, but she's very nervous about it. The next generation, myself, I do my online shopping, I do my online banking, I pay my bills that way, I do all those things, but I do get a little nervous when the ads pop up that reflect some of my shopping practices, suggesting things for me. Whereas the millennials kind of go right through that stuff. The Gen Zers, when surveyed about this, they don't understand why you wouldn't give them those suggestions. That's how they consume goods. They want you to tell them what they need based on what they've done so far, what their digital fingerprint is. So these patients, the millennials and the Gen Zers and beyond, they live in this context of a shared economy. Think Airbnb and Uber, with data transparency everywhere. Think online reviews. There's a lack of assumed privacy. And now we have all this data in the medical system that could actually help to potentially give them a highly personalized experience, which is what they're going to expect. So how can the healthcare system and the clinical research that's going to have to support it address these changing expectations? Well, enter the concept of the learning healthcare system, which is what we're going to focus on a little bit. The learning healthcare system, the goal, is to merge healthcare delivery with research, data science, and quality improvement processes. And you can see the figure on the right hand of the screen, and we're going to delve into it a bit. But basically what it shows you is that clinical care is on the left of that diagram. That's the patient-physician interaction. And then knowledge networks, the development of knowledge, are on the right side of that diagram. And there's two processes that connect them into a continuous cycle. This cycle begins and ends with the clinician-patient interaction, and it aspires to provide continuous improvement in quality, in outcomes, and healthcare efficiency over time. The goals of a learning healthcare system are to seamlessly share knowledge, transparently evaluate the impact of interventions, generate new evidence to reduce clinical and system uncertainty, and continuously learn in order to improve outcomes. In fact, the NIH Collaboratory on Healthcare Systems Research has actually said in their position statement on this that the LHS will be the vehicle by which we perform pragmatic research in the future. So pragmatic research, for those of you who might not know that term yet, it's just the new way of saying clinical research, and it has a couple little flavors to it. The first is that it's all the traditional clinical research methods, but the studies occur in everyday care settings and are a little less controlled. They also engage collaborative stakeholders to garner practical evidence that can be used more quickly. And what this does, in theory, is will expedite the pathway from discovery to practice and also improve the relevance of the research to practice. So let's now quickly finish up by talking about some of the opportunities for LHS research. How can we get engaged in this? First, at the clinician side. The evidence gap around this area is that we don't even know if clinicians understand the implications of a learning healthcare system. Will they participate? How will they do it? What are the barriers for them participating in it? What do they want from it? And would it be ethical for them to abstain from this type of medical care in the future? These are all questions that need to be answered, and there's actually funding to answer some of these questions. In terms of patients, a lot of the questions are the same with relation to patients, with the exception of we have to identify which cohorts of patients should go through a learning healthcare system first, or should the whole system just be engaged across a healthcare network or multiple networks? Which cohorts would take priority as good use cases? How would disparate data streams, so coming from multiple sources, multiple institutions, for example, how would we resolve that at the point of care? And where would be the medical home for all of this data? Is it going to live with the patient? Is it going to live with the healthcare system? Is it going to live more centrally through a master patient index, which is a separate entity? In terms of the point of care, we have to answer these questions. What is the point of care? Is it going to be virtual or is it going to be tangible? So like today, or like that example that I gave you of the lesion on the arm, where most of it is happening electronically, and some of it can actually happen without direct physician or surgeon input. It might happen through a medical communicator who is gathering information from multiple sources and engaging with the patient online. So who would be involved in this point of care? And what would be the expectations? Is it just diagnosis, prognosis, enrollment, and administration of interventions? We don't know yet. In terms of opportunities to do LHS research in order to evaluate interventions, we need to understand what kind of studies can be conducted here. How are they going to be monitored? Do we need to get informed consent? Will there be IRB processes associated with them? And will all data flow through the LHS? A great example of this is there's several adult large learning healthcare systems and networks in this country right now. And one of them was doing a study, a randomized controlled trial, to look at aspirin for stroke prevention. They did eligibility, enrollment, informed consent, administered the intervention, aspirin or placebo, and then monitored outcomes and completed the entire study, and the patient never met a study person. It all happened through their learning healthcare system and through the EHR. In terms of biomedical research and how that interfaces with the system, there's tons of questions in this area that need to be answered. Things like what kinds of data can become part of the EHR? What will be the processes and policies that would operationalize that and govern it? Can we just take information from biomedical research that hasn't gone through the peer review process and dump it right into the EHR as aggregate or as individual data? Or does it have to go through some type of other filtration process? And how do we govern biomedical research with an IRB in this kind of format? In terms of these knowledge networks that are created, we don't really know what constitutes a knowledge network yet. It's very different depending on the learning healthcare system that you're in. In some, it might be a group of specialized people. So doctors or investigators who get together decide what kind of data is going to go into the LHS and then stream back to the point of care. But it really depends on how you set up your system to know what makes the knowledge network and how it's governed. And then this is the area that I really get most fired up about, but it's around scaling interventions. How do we apply our best available evidence to each patient, distill down population health to that single person who you need to make a decision with in the office? In that node, we have to identify what constitutes evidence, what's best evidence, what are the models that are being used to power, and then distill down these recommendations to the individual level, and how are we governing these processes? The last thing we want is just lots of data trash hanging out there, right? So imagine the number of quality improvement projects you have in your division, much less your hospital, much less your healthcare system. If they're all getting pushed through one of these learning healthcare systems, when does it end? When do you pull one out? When do you put one in? How do you know when something goes from a quality improvement initiative to a solidified recommendation if things haven't gone through the peer review process? So the title of this talk was supposed to be The Future of Clinical Research in Pediatric Surgery, Are We Poised to Lead? But there's really two questions I think that I tried to answer with you today. The first is, what is the future of clinical research? I'll tell you that my opinion, I'm just one person, is that I think it's pragmatic clinical studies facilitated by informatics. And I do think the LHS will potentially be the way that we administer this in the next 20 years. And then in pediatric surgery, are we poised to lead in this environment? We're such a small profession, part of the smallest sector of the healthcare economy. Are we poised to lead? And I have a resounding yes to that. And the reason I say that is because, for several reasons. We have a very appealing profession. I think it's somewhat immodest to say, but I'll say it anyway. I think we get the brightest of the bright who want to do what we do. And these are young people, and they love this stuff, and they're motivated to learn it and develop skills in this area. And they understand it. They intuitively understand it. We are patient-centric decision makers at our very core of how we practice and how we do clinical research. We're a very collaborative field, especially compared to other areas of healthcare. Rare diseases tend to make excellent use cases for this type of work, and we're the masters of the rare diseases. But clinical content expertise is not the only avenue to conduct meaningful research and to get federal funding to do research in this area. And we have a head start in understanding the adult healthcare sector's population because of the millennials and because of the Gen Zers, because we're treating them now. So how do we get there? Well, we need leaders that will embrace this type of research, take the time to try to learn about it and understand it, because it is really difficult to grasp until you see it in action. And then seek out health system level opportunities to filter down to their junior faculty members. And we need those faculty members and those trainees coming up the pipeline to get some development, not just in traditional clinical research methods or QI or implementation science, but also in informatics and organizational behavior and organizational operations and strategy and management. And we absolutely have to have cross-disciplinary collaboration. And I would argue it's not just outside of pediatric healthcare, but it's actually outside of healthcare. So we have to remember, and it's sometimes hard to do this, that healthcare is a good and service. It's a consumed good and service, especially in this country. And so the more we go outside of healthcare to look about behavioral patterns and how people are accessing goods and services, the more adept and able we're going to be to do this kind of work into the future. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions when we're all done.
So we're going to transition to talking a little bit about how technology affects our practice. Dr. James Wall is a pediatric surgeon who focuses mostly on minimally invasive approaches to children's surgery. He's an alumnus of the Stanford Biodesign program and holds a master's degree in bioengineering. His research focuses on how we educate others to design, and he's the director of the Byers Center for Biodesign and Innovation Fellowship at Stanford. He's also going to explain to us how robots who do backflips are going to help us.
Much. Do you have the clicker, or is it up on the podium? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Specific thanks. No, oh, here it is. Specific thanks to the program committee and Dr. Herschel for giving me this opportunity to speak. I was charged with talking about the future of clinical care in pediatric surgery, and I've adapted this a little to try and play off of what we heard about throughout this week. We heard Mike Muley from Google talk about artificial intelligence and all the applications of that across medicine. We heard Mark Rabert from Boston Dynamics talk about how cool robots are and how they can be autonomous and do interesting things. But I really want to try and put those things together with as much understanding as I have about data and how to use it to talk about how we might be practicing in 2045. It's the big green button for anyone who comes up here next. A few disclosures. I do work with a few companies that I've been involved in through Biodesign and other consulting opportunities. I won't speak about any of these beyond this disclosure slide. Probably the most important disclosure is that I am not an expert in AI, robotics, or the future. I did code in C+ in college, which makes Stanford students think I'm a dinosaur, but it does have some analytical backing. My wife works at Google, and I learned by osmosis, so that's probably helpful. And maybe most importantly, in one of these companies that I worked on where we have sensors and data and the ability to think about applying artificial intelligence and machine learning, I hired someone way smarter than me to work on it and learned a little bit from them. So I'll try and put this together in the agenda for the talk. I want to talk about the limitations of individual intelligence as we hit the intelligence topic. I want to give you a story of collective consciousness from a different industry. I then want to talk about exactly where we are today with medical intelligence and automation. I want to hit on pitfalls as we think about developing these things for our profession, for kids, and ultimately make some suggestions on what we should do tomorrow and in the near future. So to start with a story of limitations of individual intelligence, I will start with myself. I had a 1-month-old baby girl who had a prenatal diagnosis of an abdominal cyst. We've all dealt with that. The initial initial ultrasound showed it in one spot. A follow-up postnatal ultrasound showed it in a different spot. They were hedging whether it might be echogenic bowel pattern or not. And I decided to go in with the differential diagnosis of an ovarian cyst, number 1, 2, and 3, a duplication cyst, number 4, and no other plan. So once I got in, and this is as a junior attending, my experience with hepatic cysts was exactly 0. How many people in the room have run into a hepatic cyst and dealt with it? Well, that would have been helpful to know. So, how did I feel at this moment? There's supposed to be sound on this. Anyone knows the clip. The first step in this operation is
to shave the patient.
So that's how I felt. What did I do? I did what I think most people in the room would do, which was to call a friend, a senior colleague, Dr. Hartman. By calling Dr. Hartman, I increased the total intelligence of the moment from an experience of 0 hepatic cysts to an experience of 2, which is certainly exponentially better than where I started, but probably not as good as it could be. So was it the right move to phone a friend? Maybe, or maybe not. And I'll credit Dr. Ponsky for this idea. And when you think about the show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, when you look at the statistics on how people get questions right, what would you think the best way to get a question right is? It was a game show of 4 multiple choice questions, and as you progress through, you could make $1 million. So you had the option of a couple different lifelines over the series of the show, but there was the 50-50 where they would take it down to 2 answers. There was the phone a friend or expert, and then there was the crowdsource where you ask all the average Joes and Janes in the audience, what do you think? 50-50 got people to 62% because they usually didn't get rid of the obvious answers. It went down to the 2 hardest, but it increased your chances a little. Phoning an expert got you to 2/3 of the way. Crowdsourcing was 91% successful in getting the right answer. So how do we think about using that? The problem I highlighted is limitations of individual intelligence. How do we get to something collective? Let me tell you something about a different industry where I had sort of an aha moment that, wow, maybe this could work in surgery. This is a story of the autonomous car industry. This is my friend Paul's car. It's a beautiful Tesla. As you probably know with Teslas, they have sensors and they're always monitoring what's going on. They're basically a supercomputer with wheels. They have the autopilot system that can kind of drive a little bit for you. So what happened with Paul is that he was driving down the road to my house. And the other thing that the Tesla has is his Tesla, not all of them, has a pneumatic system that can raise and lower the car's suspension. So the car's driving fast on the highway, drops down, aerodynamics, it comes back to slower roads and rugged terrain, and the suspension will come up. So Paul's driving down, and there's 2 speed bumps on the road on the way into my house, and I think in Boston they would call them wicked speed bumps. They're pretty nasty. Paul hits the first one, blows out his pneumatic system, and the car kind of drops. He hits the second one, and literally the front of his car explodes. So in a normal situation with a normal car, what would who would have learned from this and what would have happened? Well, Paul certainly wouldn't drive fast down my road anymore. The mechanic who fixed it would probably know to avoid our town. And maybe a few people in my neighborhood would realize, yeah, not a good idea, and tell their friends. So a little bit of knowledge gained. The aha moment for me was 2 weeks later, I was driving with another friend who has a similar Tesla. He works for the company, and it is a beta version. As we approached the first speed bump, the car gave him a warning that there's terrain coming, there could be an object in the road, and the car automatically raised up to its maximum suspension. And in the words of one of my great mentors, Tom Crummell, it was just like, whoa, how does it do that? And it's putting together the collective consciousness, adding in automation. And so what I'd like to talk about a little bit is how the cars do this, how they can do this, and then how could we maybe leverage that in surgery. You always have to start one of these talks with how good computers are. I won't belabor this point. Moore's law is probably known by everybody. I think a great analogy is if you take the progress of the Intel chip from 1971 to currently, they've increased performance by 3,500 times. It's 90,000 times more energy efficient, 60,000 times lower in cost. If you did that with a VW Beetle from 1971, it would do 300,000 miles an hour. It would get 2 million miles to the gallon, which is handy with gas prices, and the car would cost you 4 cents. You layer on top of computer processing speeds being really fast, incredible amounts of data that we're gathering. And again, I won't belabor it, but companies who are gathering data are gaining great value. A quick primer for those of you who didn't make Mike Mully's talk on artificial intelligence. It's computer systems that try and do human-like tasks, and when they can do them, they're called artificially intelligent. Machine learning are algorithms on top of that can learn and improve with experience. They learn from what they've seen. And then deep learning are more complex systems that kind of mimic the human brain to do similar tasks. Who uses AI in here? How about if I ask the question differently? Who booked travel to come to this meeting? Anybody? Anybody talk to a home assistant like a Siri or Alexa? How about using a credit card? Because all fraud protection these days by the major credit cards are AI. Mapping software, social media streaming, et cetera, et cetera. The consumer tech world is using AI for everything, and it is probably touching you. But I think the big question is, where are we today for medical AI? This is a list of the currently approved, FDA-approved AI systems in medicine, and I'll summarize them for you. It's not worth looking through each one individually. They are generally diagnostic currently, and they generally use what I call not-so-big data. And what I mean by that is they use already structured digital signals such as PACS radiology systems in DICOM format or digitized EKGs. Is that stuff going to be relevant to surgery? Maybe in the diagnostic pre-op stage, but probably we need better than that if we're going to be looking at how we apply this in real-time surgery. Is there a promise for the future? I think there is. So these are not FDA approved yet, but these are peer-reviewed publications that show a step up in AI, now using visual processing, which is more complicated, takes more computing power. A computer system is able to beat 58 dermatologists in determining if a lesion on the skin is malignant or not based on picture alone, and similar story for diabetic retinopathy. So as we think about going back to the autonomous car, how far have they really gotten with that, and how can we learn from that in medicine? This was 6 months ago, a little bit scary, also very cool. Also a shout out to country music in the first line for anyone who likes country music. But Waymo announced, which is an Alphabet company, that they had approval in California to truly have autonomous cars. So in my neighborhood right now, there are cars that have no driver. There's no backup. It doesn't even have a steering wheel in some of the versions. Literally no steering wheel. So I think it's an exercise worth going through in how this system works to think about, could that ever happen in surgery? So what does an autonomous car that's truly driving itself do? It starts with a plan. It uses available data sources like maps, its geolocation, traffic, etc., terrain, and it makes a decision on how it's going to get somewhere. It then drives. This is a big deal. So it's using perception with sensors, it's using decision-making, it's using manipulation of a physical system like the raising and lowering of the Tesla, it's moving the wheels, And it's doing all of this in real time. This is not an insignificant computing task, but it's happening, it's approved. And then finally, it optimizes. It learns, I made the wrong left turn. It needs feedback that that was wrong and understand how to fix that. And this is where AI comes in, and machine learning algorithms can take that feedback and turn it into better decisions at the front end, at the driving end. But surgery's different, right? Maybe, maybe not. The cognitive load of surgery is admittedly high, probably higher for early learners than at the experienced stage, so it may or may not be higher. Failures are certainly unacceptable, but they're not particularly acceptable in aviation and automotive industries as well. So what if we take that blueprint of the autonomous car and think about surgery? I'm going to share with you where we are with surgical tools now. So we talked about general medical AI and visual imaging. Let's talk about surgical tools. I'm going to use the example of Procept Surgical, which you probably don't know about because it's the opposite end of our care spectrum, treating benign prostatic hypertrophy. The system uses a high-pressure, very precise water jet that's delivered transurethral to debride or cut out prostatic tissue. And it does this in a similar fashion to autonomous cars. It starts with data and a decision. So the system uses available data on the prostate size and topography that's known beforehand. It takes physician input, and a decision is made ahead of time on how the procedure will be performed. The system then, in real time, does what a driverless car does. It perceives what's going on with sensors, particularly in this case, a real-time ultrasound sensor. It makes decisions based on where it is, and it cuts the tissue using a highly precise water jet, what's called an aquablation. It's done under the supervision of a physician at this point, but you can imagine this is the roadmap. This is an approved system. Now, what does it not have? The only thing it doesn't have yet, although it's not hard to imagine, is the feedback AI loop. So it's gotten to the level of autonomy. It needs to add in outcome data, objective measures like urine flow and other things that are relevant to this case. And then we could add this arrow of true feedback and intelligence. And you combine intelligence and automation, and you have the surgical system, or really the procedural system of the future. So, if we go back to this one for a second, what are the pitfalls that we need to think about if we're going to take this, which was obviously designed for urology, different field, and try and think about, is there areas in pediatric surgery we might want to play around and develop intelligence and automation? I think the first thing to think about is translation. This system's really good if you're an old white man, probably not good for a more diverse patient population. Translation is really important, and going back to the analogy of the autonomous car industry, a car driving by itself in sunny California is one thing. You put it in Buffalo, New York, and it hasn't done really well. So translating from what's been done in adult to kids is going to be hard. We know that's what we have done for years with the advent of laparoscopic surgery, et cetera, but we really need to think that through for autonomy and intelligence. I highlight this one to specifically show that even autonomous cars are not paying attention to children. This is from the owner's manual of the Volvo system, or the instructions for use for the Volvo self-driving system, talking about the cyclist detection feature. Quote, "The cyclist must be an adult riding an adult-sized bike." So literally they're ignoring children. So we can't let that happen with development of this technology. The second pitfall I would point out is that we really need to think about how you supervise the learning of these systems. And I'll tell a quick story that I think highlights that. This comes from a colleague of mine, Dr. Lundgren, who's a radiologist, who did some of the very early studies in using AI to determine pneumonias on chest radiographs. And they started out with a learning set of radiographs from one hospital that had a high pneumonia rate, and they thought that would be good because you want to see a lot of the disease process. And then they had a bunch of regular radiographs, normal, non-disease radiographs from another hospital. System went through, it did some supervised and unsupervised learning, and in the end, it was calling pneumonias as well as radiologists off a relatively small learning set. Then they opened up the hood and said, what did the system pick as the number one predictor of pneumonia? What did it learn? What it learned was that the two hospitals had different fiducials, and that the one that they took the learning set of a lot of pneumonias, it figured out that that fiducial was different, and that was the number one predictor of pneumonia. That's not good. That's not going to scale to 100,000 radiographs in different places. So the point being, supervision of learning is important. And then the final thing I think is we really think about if we can develop this for pediatric surgery and beyond is skill degradation. And the airline industry is an example of this, where automation has made aircraft incredibly safe. It prevents pilots from maneuvers that can stall planes and cause nosedives, etc. But it has come at the expense potentially of pilots' capabilities in situations where they don't have autonomy. And Air France 447 was an example of that. It was a flight that, if you've read about, was flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, hit some minor turbulence. The sensor for airspeed was iced over, and a relatively inexperienced pilot who didn't even understand that a plane could be flown without autonomy that prevented it from stalling essentially stalled the airplane because the autonomous system cut off, and he was ill-prepared to deal with that. And I think there's a direct correlation with surgery. The more that we add autonomy to both our decision-making and even maybe to surgical practice, we need to think about how we maintain our skill set. So I'd like to conclude with what should we do tomorrow? I think this was Jim Geiger's question at the end of the AI talk from our colleague from Google. I think first and foremost, we need to think about these technologies, intelligence and automation, and find the right clinical needs in pediatric surgery. Technology for the sake of technology is not going to improve outcomes, but if we see where it can be appropriately applied, then we can take the lead. I think we should join forces. You know, we're a small group. We have small groups of patients. To leverage data, you really need volume and size. And joining forces to collect data, as we've done for all kinds of collaboratives around pediatric surgery, could be done here as well. And importantly, we need to put it in an optimized format so that machine learning and other things can be applied to it. We'll also have to hire people way smarter than us to do that, but different issue. I think we should oversee the learning and implementation of the technologies. So to the point of the fiducials, we don't want systems learning the wrong things and making changes in our practice based on that. So there does need to be oversight of this. Course track outcomes, it's the obvious one, but make sure that what we're intending to do, we do. And finally, I think consider alternative means to maintaining surgical skills to the pitfall I pointed out about automation and the degradation of skills. So what do I see in 2045? That was the question. I hope to be on a boat in the Caribbean. What I hope to be happening here is that hepatic cyst, no one will ever run into that and not know what to do. That plus the entire collective consciousness of this group could somehow be delivered to either the surgeon or the automated system so that it has the intelligence to make the right decisions, and ultimately then leverage autonomy to avoid problems and optimize our outcomes as surgeons. With that, I'll say thank you very much, and we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
So our final talk is going to be on basic science and translational medicine. Dr. Mike Helmrath is a professor of surgery in Cincinnati, one of my partners. He runs an active basic science lab as well as a translational lab that's actually being continuously externally funded since the time he actually finished fellowship. He's one of the founding members for the Center of Stem Cell and Organoid Medicine, which currently has over $20 million in funding. He's published widely with over 100 publications in journals such as the New England, Nature, and Lancet. Dr. Helmrath.
Thanks, Roshni. Wow, this is a great session. It's a great meeting. And I'm really excited that I get to talk to you about research, because I know that in the very near future, the way you care for your patients, as well as you yourself, is going to be changed by the rapid evolvement of science that we currently see today. So the one thing that is a commonality across all the talks that you heard today is best, I think, summarized by this analogy of 0 to 1 versus 1 to 2. One is what we all know. For me, I'm a pediatric surgeon that really struggles with best ways to take care of patients with complex intestinal failure. So one defines what we know, and we try to make that better. And so for me, that meant going to the lab and using animal models, which are good for identifying mechanisms of action, but getting them back to the patients, as you've noticed by coming to these meetings year in year, doesn't happen very often. Why? Clinical trials, Kate gave us really good examples, are able to tell us a lot of things. How often have you heard there's been no major advancements over the last decade in X disease? And then they show you the new thing that they're going to do. Why? I would argue, just as a side, that knowing the natural history of diseases is very important. And the things that Kate also talked about will really inform us as how to evaluate what we do. But when things change, it's when something happens. It's an aha, it's an O, it's a zero that you've never thought of before that you now have. And by having it, you actually have a number, a 0.4 to work with, to see a problem in a new way, to give you a new toolbox, to answer a problem that you've never had before. And that's what science gives us. So although there's many things I could talk to you about today, I'm going to talk to you about pluripotent stem cells, because that's something that I know a lot about, and I really think it's going to make a difference. So we all know about embryonic stem cells. There's been work on embryonic stem cells for decades. For social reasons, there's a lot of advancements haven't occurred. I show you a picture of Dr. Yamanaka, who first published in 2006 the ability to take a differentiated fibroblast and induce it into a pluripotent state by using Yamanaka factors that I show you above his head. What this essentially has done is taking any proliferating cell, and for any of the patients I talked to you about today, that's from a blood draw of any of you, take that cell and induce it into a state that it can become any tissue in our body. That is an iPS cell. That's different than the somatic stem cells that we can get by just taking a stem cell out and growing it in a tissue dish. And this really provides us a powerful tool to start attacking new questions. So, to quote Dr. Tapper, what's my audacious goal? My audacious goal is to take a patient's cell, create their own intestine in a dish that I can put into the baby. It grows, develops with its own blood supply, its own bowel, that functions, that I can then place into continuity, and it can actually help me address the issues of short bowel syndrome. In addition, and probably even greater than this dream, is the ability to use that tissue therapeutically to answer questions about drug screening and disease formations in humans that we really have no idea to know today. How's that going to work? So I would argue, if you want to solve a problem and you want to stay in a silo, you may create a better career for yourself and a name, but the likelihood of a zero moment has been dramatically reduced. If you want to have a zero moment, build a team. For me, that team includes developmental biologists I show you on the left that are dear friends that have worked with me over the last decade. And with the knowledge that we have, we've been able to take these inducible pluripotent stem cells and basically derive tissue all the way from the mouth to the anus since 2011. How do we do it? You take a pluripotent stem cell and you can induce it into a confluent sheet of definitive endoderm. And then by patterning it with different growth factors, it will become a fore or hindgut structure that when grown in a 3D culture dish, fully has the embryonic characteristics that you would expect, frankly, of a 18-week-old human. But it never went beyond that until we took those structures and transplanted them, in this case, within the kidney capsule of a mouse. And it grows, as you see, into a fully laminated intestine that histologically doesn't just have crypts and villi, but it has muscle. And if you look at the digestive functions of it, it's completely capable, it's functional. So it's essentially bowel. This was published by Kerry Watson, who was a resident in my lab, now finishing fellowship at UT Houston, very proud of him. And I'm just giving you one example here that Kerry did in a model that we have of resection to demonstrate that if you put that graft in the kidney, it doesn't see food, it doesn't see luminal biliary pancreatic secretions, it will respond to the resection in the mouth. It's no different than the mouse's intestine. So that tells you two things. It tells you, one, the tissue we're growing can respond to systemic therapy, and I'll show you examples of that in the future. But number two, it tells me that my babies I can't feed, that I want their bowel to fully develop and grow, I can do that systemically. We just have to come up with the right solutions. New tool to take care of a problem that I think is going to change the way we take care of our kids. So the gold standard in the lab over the last couple of years is to be able to take, again, one cell from a human, make their own individual iPS cells, drive it into an intestine that looks like this every time. A single lumen fully. This isn't like a little patch. This isn't a little bit of this and a little bit of that with some cartilage. This is a full intestine, nothing but intestine. So with this model, we've been able to transplant in many spaces, and I choose commonly to place this within the mesentery. It'll have the same blood supply of the gut. It allows us to give oral medications to the animal and see how it affects the gut. It allows us to directly inject medications. We do this commonly for many drugs, mostly right now cystic fibrosis drugs, but it also allows us to connect that piece of tissue to the mouse's own intestine, thereby giving it the same exposure to microbiome and metabolome as the mouse. This is very important. What I show you here is work that Max Mahi and Holly Pooling did in my lab, where they sewed these grafts to the bowel. And this is 2 weeks later. And if you look closely, you'll see in the middle is the microbiome of the, I call it HIO. The mouse's bowel is left and right. And it has similar but very different bacteria adherent to the mucosa. So within the same pool, human mucosa is changing the microbiome. When we want to learn about the influence of microbiome in the gut, we need models like this. We can't do this in living humans. We can't do this in mice. This is another tool, I think, that's going to change the way we look at a lot of diseases in the gut. Now, if you recognize that I'm showing you muscle and mucosa, that doesn't take care of the gut entirely, right? It has nerves, it has an immune system. We need next generation intestines. So we attack that by knowing that the nerves don't start in the gut, they migrate. So using the same iPS cells, we make neurospheres. And we can combine them in a dish, and I'm showing you here the fluorescence of the nerves themselves firing in vitro. And I'll show you below just the fact that the nerves have a profound effect in development of the gut, both in vitro and in vivo. Does it work when we transplant it? Unfortunately, my movie doesn't work, but if it did, you would see that the actual bowel is peristalsing in the bottom, and we're able to completely form neural networks. The next generation thing we also are doing is done by Katherine in my lab, where we have to transplant, I didn't say this, these structures into immunodeficient mice or else they reject human tissue. So they don't have an immune system where we would as humans. And so we want to look at the immune component of the graft. And so basically, Katherine came up with a humanized model by which cord blood was used to both do bone marrow transplants into the mice and to make the structures. And interestingly, what she's been able to show is that the bone marrow will completely engraft, as we would in a developing gut, and the animal has a complete component of human immune cells within the bowel. But what I wanted was Peyer's patches and signaling that happens in early gut, and that's not what happened. We just had to take our experiments out a couple extra weeks, and so we're now forming fully structures, lymphatic structures, lymph nodes in the gut, which are very helpful because we can collect out those cells and we can start learning about how immunity is formed in humans. Again, something you could never do without a model like this. So here's an example of a collaboration we did with James Dunn, now at Stanford, where he has a device that lengthens the bowel. And in short, really what this taught us was that the fact that axial forces exist within developing gut, we need to mimic. And taking this, we really went back and developed ways to grow these spheroids in a dish in a different way where we take advantage of these forces during early development in vitro. And with this, We've been able to get the HIOs to fuse as long as we want. I show you on the left mice, on the right is a rat. We've done them in pigs as well. And so what we now are able to do is actually what I showed you as a gold standard HIO, which is a little less than a centimeter, which is beautiful. We can make as long tube as we want with a single lumen. Notice that the mouse's intestine is very small. The only thing limiting the size of this is the size of the animal. So I really feel like today the ability for us to grow and make a human intestine is real.
That's it? I'd like some fresh, clear, well-seasoned perspective. Can you suggest a good wine to go with that?
So perspective is related to time and space. So look at the bottom left. I love that cartoon because if you're on an island for weeks and you see a boat, you're excited. And if you're on a boat for weeks and you see someone on an island, you're excited. But you're both probably screwed. But if you take the perspective of where we are now, I'm like, what we're doing is bigger than NIH labs and research. We got to get this out to patients. And so the group of doctors that you see above there is Jim Wells. Taka Takabe is a very talented surgeon from Japan that's now in our GI, and I'll show you some of his data. We needed a space where we can translate our stuff out to the industry, out to the world, so we can get it to the hospitals. We work together as research, but we need a space, and I call that an accelerator space. This accelerator space is where we have now generated a place where we do reproducibly making our tissues. We do it efficiently, and we automate it. So it can be done at real time, 7/24, and we can actually image. On the bottom left, you see confocal imaging that we're capable of doing on real plates at real time. So it's kind of fun, it's kind of cool. Why do we need to do that? Well, here's an example. Did you know the most common cause of a drug failing right now is toxicity? There's 3 drugs that were taken off the market this year at phase 3, over $4 billion of investment because patients had liver toxicity. What you're seeing here is liver we grew from specific patients exposed to bile, and we can in real-time image see that bile being taken up. When they're exposed to drugs that are cholestatic, as I give you examples on the bottom, you can tell that that uptake is inhibited, suggesting that that drug's going to potentially have a liver problem. Would be nice to know before you go to a phase 3 liver trial and you try and you use all that money. Another example is patients that we have in my obesity clinic with NASH and NAFLD that we know have a risk of having liver inflammation. There's a lot of drugs that pharmacologists are trying to make to prevent this NASH and NAFLD. So what we have here is a system where we can grow these livers, and we can test them for their fibrosis and their scarring. The bottom left movie isn't showing, but we're actually able in real time to show the wall of the liver. So screening for potential drugs that we'll be able to treat. And so these are all things that will come out of the accelerator space. So what I'd like to leave you with is this last comment, and that I really think we all pride ourselves for the diseases we take care of. And there really are orphans, but I would remind you that development happens to everything. And what's going to happen, the old moment's going to happen, is that most diseases in adulthood start in the first few years of life. And once we realize that and realize we can treat the diseases that are most commonly seen in the world, our field is just going to further expand. So thank you, and I look forward to being able to answer any questions with the rest of the group. I would just like to thank the Farmer Foundation family, which has supplied significant amount of money for my dream of this accelerator space to be a reality. Thank you.
So we are going to have 5 minutes for questions. I invite the rest of the speakers to come on up. You just go to the seat.
What? That was good.
Question. Can you grow nerve ganglion cells and have them migrate into the distal bowel?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, we can make nerve cells. What makes them migrate is proliferation and differentiation. And so I didn't show you our work with Hirschsprungs, but I think the key aspect of that question is understanding what drives maturation of the ENS and the migration, and that once we learn how to support the development of that in the gut, you're going to see a benefit not just in the Hirschsprung's patients, but many others. And yes, you might want to inject precursors later, but I honestly think that knowing the natural history and how to drive those cells are why maybe you see some of your Hirschsprungs kids where you've done a correct resection still are having motility problems. So that speaks to the fact that the science is going to help us understand best treatments. And yeah, maybe we will have to put some cells in, but I think those will be not the only way to solve that problem.
Thank you.
Quick question for Katherine. So with all of your aspirations for what you hope for, what clinical research could be or learning, the one problem that seems to have been really hindering us over the past 5 years is interoperability. And I thought there was some optimism when I heard the president put Jared Kushner in charge of that, but that wasn't to be. But I still am amazed at the amount of capital that's been put into electronic health records, and yet interoperability is still massive. So I wanted to know your impression of that, and when is that not going to be an issue?
You nailed it. That's the Achilles heel for the learning healthcare system as an example. It's garbage in, garbage out. Right? That's what it is. And we all know that within the electronic health record, many of us do a lot of workarounds. And so we're not collecting the correct data in the correct places. So there's a couple things around learning healthcare systems that are assumptions for if you condone them. Let me tell you the first is data equals truth. So the data is correct. That's a big assumption for these systems. The second is that shared decision-making is best and that people have equal value in their opinions on how to get things done. And then the last is that the processes of merging preferences with data and associating them with the outcomes, those processes are impenetrable. So wow, those are three big assumptions that need to be tested and overcome in a variety of ways. One of the ways we get around interoperability in the EHR for these large data systems is just in the sheer volume of data and then the statistical modeling that goes into being able to negotiate the different disparate data points together. So that's one of the ways it happens. But that's why there's so much research money out there to study these things, because people know it's coming and they want to do it right. That's why I think it's really the future of clinical research for young investigators to get out and get involved. And there are K awards now for this, by the way.
Our three speakers.